All right. So we had the 3 breakout questions on the table. The first one being, Cassandra back in, 1 second. The first question being, how does Gilroy seek to problematize notions of modernity through his focus on enslavement and Black subjectivity? What were some of your thoughts as it pertains to that question? So, Stacy, how did your group talk about how Gilroy problematizes modernity through his focus on enslavement and Black subjectivity?
So we talked about how I think he thinks that modernity doesn't talk about it it doesn't include everything that happened, and everybody doesn't talk about everything that happened. So there was a quote, and I highlighting, oh, here it is. So on page 49, the quote that I highlighted says, modernity is apprehended. So he's talking about one of the authors that he talked about before. Modernity is apprehended through its counter discourses and often defended solely through its counterfactual elements. Yet their analyses remain substantially unaffected by the histories of barbarity, which appear to be such a prominent feature of the widening gap between modern experience and modern expectation. So to me, it seems like he said little things like that before, but I didn't highlight them. But it seems like he's like, everybody's just brushing over what happened. They're not talking about what really happened or the how bad it was.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Stacey. Was there any other comments I wanted to add to that discourse? All right, so you can move on to the second question. The second question is, what are Gilroy's means for problematizing modernity? I'm sorry, let me to go back looking at the chat. So for Cassandra, the first question was, how does Gilroy seek to problematize notions of modernity through his focus on enslavement or formerly enslaved and Black subjectivity is the question. So if you want to add to that, you can, Cassandra. If not, the second question is, what are Gilroy's means of problematizing modernity? So if we know, based off of what Stacy tells us, that he's attentive to the fact that they're not being completely forthcoming in how modernity has been produced, right? And part of that is what is being left out is the savagery and barbarity that produces this notion of modernity, right? So if we know that his project is to problematize how we're viewing modernity, and he's seeking to problematize how we're viewing modernity by placing the focus on the formerly enslaved and the Black subjectivity, how does he go about doing that is the question. So how did you argue Gilroy produces this problematization? Kaylin, what was discussed in your group?
I think like towards the end of reading, the author talks about how an enslaved person's like repeated choice of death rather than bondage articulates like I guess like the contrasting ideas of freedom, like that the Western world would have like what is opposed to. So yeah, that's on page 68.
Perfect. Thank you, Ken. I just wanted to write some notes real quick. Does anyone else want to add to that assertion? All right. Were there any questions that any of you all had about the reading that you want to make sure I cover in my notes?
I did actually have a question.
Okay.
I guess something that's like not really being highlighted. But this is at page 70. as he's like as Gilroy is wrapping up the chapter.
Mhm.
It begins when he said they developed this line of inquiry by seeking the answers to answer the metaphysical questions: who am I? When am I most myself? I've really tried to like work at this like statement, and I just wanted to see like if I was getting in anywhere with this. But when Gilroy talks about that, like he's basically saying like because Africans have been scattered across the diaspora, they have to essentially form their own identities in a space where their cultural identities are being suppressed. And when you get I guess avenues or creations like jazz and just other forms of artwork, Black people or Africans in generals are tapping into their who are they and when am I most myself? Like, am I like is that and like am I going anywhere with that, or is that like am I completely off?
No, you're dead on. And honestly, if you even go further into the chapter before he starts, Caitlin, we're looking at page 70, and it is towards the middle of the page, starting, the sentence starts with, they developed this line of inquiry. Right before you start to get the page breaks, as far as says above where it says some years later is what we're looking at. But to your point, Fred, so like there's an earlier part in the chapter where he starts to begin to talk about the importance of art and how art becomes for the enslaved the purest form of expression, right? So I think where you're taking this is spot on. And if you are to look at the next chapter, right, it talks about Black music and the politics of authenticity. So I think what you're picking up on is where he's planning to go forward with the chapter. And if we're talking about this notion of subjectivity, right? Like how do African people center themselves as subjects? This is one of the ways that they do so within their art, in their artistic expression, be that music, be that the forms of art themselves, and those being forms of actual protest and forms of actualization. So I think you're spot on with that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, let me see. Let's check the chat real quick. Okay. Any other question? Okay, go ahead, Shabbat. I'm sorry.
Yes, can you please elaborate on what Black subjectivity is exactly?
Okay. So like subjectivity is, so it's like, if you do a juxtaposition between objectivity, so you're an object, in enslavement, you're a form of an object, but then where a subject is a little bit more actional, someone who is not under the thumb of something else, right? It can present itself as its own player within the world. So this idea of subjectivity and trying to present yourself as a subject, right? Opposed to being the objective, which is enslaved, right? As an enslaved individual, you are the possession or the object of someone else, right? To where when you become the subject, you'll be able to act with your own agency and be an actionable person within the world. Does that make a little more sense? Okay. So when
Yes, it does.
so like when we're thinking about this idea of so if you're thinking about question one that I posed in the breakout groups, right? Like how is he problematizing this notion of modernity while looking at Black subjectivity? He's essentially arguing that this whole notion of the modern is a byproduct of enslavement, right? And you wouldn't have what we're calling the modern without enslavement, right? So if we're thinking about problematizing this notion of modernity by looking at the formerly enslaved and placing them as subjects, you're saying that they are the driving force that produces economically and structurally this concept of the modern, right? And this is kind of where I'm trying to get you all to think about as it pertains to this. So again, as Damien kind of asked us last week in regards to the final, like, how do we prepare for these texts? They're very dense, right? And, how do I situate myself to be prepared to answer questions about these texts on the final, seeing how dense they are? Which my response was, let's think in terms of themes, right? So staying with the theme of themes, I'm going to present another framework for us to think about this text through. So we know that the first framework that was offered in the quarter was African American male theory, right? So the framework for this lecture is going to be called counter storytelling. Counter narratives or counter storytelling is what the framework will be. This framework is from critical race theory. If you're paying attention to politics right now, that is a hot button topic, right? This idea of critical race theory. I believe it's like 11 states that have banned the teaching of critical race theory. I would argue and posit that none of them motherfuckers who are arguing against critical race theory really know what critical race theory is, right? The idea that this concept is being taught in K through 12 schooling settings is really a false notion. Critical race theory comes from really the legal school of thought by a lot of scholars out of legal studies, and this is really much a theory that's situated within the higher education spaces, right? So I'll be pulling from the text to kind of offer this notion of counter storytelling. And this is storytelling and this is narratives that focus on the issues of the dominated or the minoritized opposed to the issues of the dominator or the dominant, right? So if we're looking at the discovery of the Americas, we're not going to tell that story from the vantage points of Christopher Columbus, right? We're going to tell this story from the vantage points of the formerly of the indigenous people who were here to witness Columbus's arrival, right? So this would be what we call, or what we're considering, the counter narrative or counter storytelling, right? And really it's also thinking about the power of narrative. And really, if you're reading closely, this is what Gilroy is into, right? What is this narrative that we're telling ourselves about this notion of, or this idea we call modernity, right? And as Stacy points out, we know that in the telling, in the narrative of modernity, we leave out these very ugly but real consequences of modernity that make modernity possible, one of which is being enslavement. So I was doing a reread of this morning, and first of all, I want to apologize. Like, this is thick as fuck, and really, he doesn't even get into what he wants to do until like maybe like 49 or 50, and he's really placing us in the middle of this really deep philosophical debate that has very little to do with what he wants to get at within the chapter, right? But to start off, right, and he kind of lets us know what he's going to do and where he's injecting himself. He says, for some years now, Euro-American social theory, philosophy, and cultural criticism have hosted bitter and politically charged debates into the scope and status of the concept of modernity and the related ideas of modernism and modernization. So with this passage, right, he's letting you know that there's these debates going forth. But what he's going to do is interject himself into these debates and problematize the focus of what problematize the focus of the debates and kind of place them where he feels the focus should be. Okay. I'm gonna move ahead a little bit to page 44. And I'm looking at the middle of the page. The periodization is the start of the sentence that I'm looking at. It says the periodization of the modern and the postmodern is thus the most profound importance for the history of Blacks in the West and for chronicling the shifting relations of domination and subordination between Europeans and the rest of the world. Is essential for our understanding of the category of race itself and of the genesis and development of the successive forms of racist ideology. It is relevant above all in elaborating an interpretation of the origins and evolution of Black politics. This task requires careful attention to the complex intermixture of African and European philosophical and cultural systems and ideas, okay? So one, he's telling us, if you really want to get to the history of the Black experience in the West, the period that you need to focus on is the beginning of modernization, or this idea that they call the postmodern, right? Because it chronicles the shifts in relations between Europe and the rest of the world, right? It shifts the relations of domination and subordination, right? And then it's also essential for understanding the category that we call race and how these pathologies get produced. So if you want to learn these things, the period that you need to study is this period of modernization, or what they call the postmodern, right? So this kind of gives you some slight insight into the work that he seeks to do. looking on page 45, on the second paragraph, right after it says chapter 1, the sentence that starts with the distinctive historical experiences of the diaspora's population have created a unique body of reflections on modernity and its discontents, which is an enduring presence in the cultural and political struggles of their descendants. I want to bring to the fore elements of this alternative sequence of inquiries into the politics of the life in the West. This discontinuous tradition has been occulted by the dominance of European and American writing elites, whose loud modernist voices have dominated the clamor of philosophical and political discourse that reaches out from the 18th century to haunt us now. However, I'm suggesting something more than the coercive inclusion of those Black commentaries on the modern, which have so far been overlooked by Western intellectual history. I intend not only to question the credibility of a tidy, holistic conception of modernity, but also to argue for the inversion of the relationship between the margin and the center as it has appeared within the master discourse of the master race. Anytime you see, in other words, you gotta pay attention because he's gonna say what he just said again, but just in a different formulation, right? In other words, I'm seeking to contribute. I'm sorry, Cassandra, this is page 45, towards the middle of the page, the sentence starting after chapter 1. Says, in other words, I'm seeking to contribute some reconstructive intellectual labor, which through looking at the modern cultural history of Blacks in the modern world, has great bearings on the idea of what the West was and is today. This initially requires a return to and rethinking of the characteristically modern relationship between master and the slave. So there's a lot to unpack within this paragraph, right? But if we look towards like towards the end, right? He says that there's this tradition of European intellectuals writing about modernity, right? And they're writing about it in a way that he calls, tidy. He calls it a tidy and holistic, right? But he says, I want to question this tidy and holistic conceptualization of modernity, I want to argue for the inversion of the relationship between the margin and the center, right? So what I want to do is bring what was normatively on the margins, right? The experiences of the African and the formerly enslaved. I want to bring those experiences to the center. And I want to bring what's normally in the center, the experiences of the Europeans, right? And place those to the margin. So I want to invert these two realities. So if you think about what our framework is today, counter storytelling, he's explicitly telling us here, the work that I'm seeking to do is produce a counter storytelling, a counter narrative account of modernity, right? By inverting who are the subjects. So when I do my work on modernity, the subjects of my work will be the enslaved. Damien?
Sorry, I hope I didn't cut you off. But I was just, well, Stacy actually brought that paragraph up in our discussion. I thought it was a great paragraph that really outlined the whole premise of what we're reading and sort of what you talked about as like the overall theme. But my question would be, does his kind of opposition to modernity, since I think I've kind of connected, and maybe it's an error that I've connected modernity with a close tie to like maybe Pan-Africanism, where it's like, it's sort of, I don't know if it's this book or like that front page where it makes Africa look great and very modern, and that modernity, does his opposition go against that, or does he say we can't get that until we look to the past?
Okay, so I think one, that's a good question. Two, I think his opposition to modernity is how the story of modernity is being told, right? It's not a complete and honest telling of modernity. So when they tell the story of modernity, they're going to talk about the advancements. They're going to talk about the new art that's produced. They're going to talk about how we have a shift in human perspective from being a collective whole to the individual. So these are some of the byproducts of modernity, right? But what we're not going to talk about is how the wealth of the Western power was contrived through enslaved labor, right? We're not going to talk about how the establishing of America was done on the brutality and the attempted erasure of indigenous people, right? So Gilroy's saying, yo, this is the problem with modernity, right? It's the thing, it's here. I can't argue against its presence, but what I do have a gripe with is how these European thinkers are telling this particular story, right? And so what I'm going to do within my problematization of modernity is tell this story from a different lens. And the lens that I'm going to tell the story from will have African people at the center of the story. And that's really the problem that he has with modernity. So I'm not sure what book you're referring to, but if I'm thinking about what we've read prior to this, I'm thinking about the book on world making and self-determination, more so from the aspect of self-determination, because what Gilroy is attentive to are African people's self-determination during the production of modernity, right? How Frederick Douglass was able to travel across the Atlantic and produce these types of thinkings that help to produce the emancipation of African people. How this self-determination of music and artistic production speaks to the subjectivity of African people, right? So these are the things that like Gilmore seeks to highlight as he's thinking about this idea of modernity. Does that make sense for you, Damien?
Yes, sorry, I think I maybe confused world making with like storytelling and like or what you just said about story making.
Yes, yeah. So yeah, I think though
Are they similar maybe?
they are, because so here's where they conflate, right? It's the world making that happens, but these world makings produce narrative. You see what I'm saying? And this is what Gilroy is talking to. So really, the production of modernity is a world making, right? The way that they come together to produce this idea of what's modern, of what's new, and what is, that is the world being made, right? But what Gilroy is saying is, within this world making, let's be careful of the narratives that are being told about how this world was made. Let's tell complete, open, and honest narratives around how this particular world was made. So that's where I can see the conflation of this notion of world making and the idea of narratives, right? Because narratives help us understand and make sense of how worlds were made. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Cool, perfect. All right. I only have a few more notes. Yes. Okay. So looking at the chat, right? And I think Fred brings up a good point. He says that Gilroy is doing his own critique and corrective on history, essentially. Yes, and that's exactly what it is. In fact, he even tells us, right? I'm looking on page 45 before the passage that I just read, starting with that chapter break, right? And he says, I want to also offer a critique of and a corrective to these exchanges, and my fundamental concern with the history of the African diaspora necessitates the specific starting point, the Black Atlantic, right? So this idea of the critique and the corrective, again, as I've been mentioning throughout the semester or the quarter, this is a foundational element of Black thought, right? Most of the intellectual work that African thinkers are doing are critiques and correctives, right? And so this is why those pages that I say are almost unnecessary at the beginning of the chapter become important, right? Because he's laying these arguments out to show why we need to critique, right? And then once he's laid out the work of all these European thinkers, the Hegels, right? The Humes, all these European thinkers, then he begins to do his corrective work by getting into things like Black subjectivity and things like the Black arts, right? So this notion of critique and corrective becomes foundationally important. Let's see. On page 46 below, Slavery and the Enlightenment Project, towards the end of that paragraph, he says, in opposition to this view. So he lays out this argument on the top of the paragraph. Again, that's only to offer his critique, right? So he says, I'm already against what I just laid out in the subsequent paragraph or in the previous paragraph. I'm not with that, right? So in opposition to this view, I propose, this is my corrective, that the history of the African diaspora and a reassessment of the relationship between modernity and slavery may require a more complete revision of the terms in which the modernity debates have been constructed than any of its academic participants may be willing to concede, excuse me. So now we're starting to take shots at the academy, right? It's like how I'm thinking about modernity and how I want to think about modernity as it is in comparison with enslavement. Most of the academics who are engaged in this debate, they're not willing to go there, right? So I'm taking this conversation to a place that most people, most of my peers aren't willing to do. And I think this becomes important twofold, right? If you're reading this, he's showing you that I know what my opposition is thinking, right? I know the opposing thoughts. I'm well read in this subject matter. I know both sides of the coin, right? But what I'm seeking to do is move this conversation in a different direction. So as a thinker, this is something that you want to be able to do. Either go into new territory, right? Or complicate or add on what's already being said. But to do the latter, you have to know what's already being said. And this is why he's offering you this counter argument before he says in opposition to this view, right? So it's just showing you, you have, so I believe it was Omi a couple courses ago, she says, you know, if I look up the author and he white, I don't even read that shit, right? I feel you. But to know the other side's argument, you may want to engage those thinkers just to prove them wrong. And this is the work that Gilroy is trying to do. Shabbat, did you have your hand up?
Yes, I think I see the correlation between what Gilroy is saying and critical race theory or whatever, what my working definition of critical race theory is. And then I think about Ibram Kendi, and I think about how his use of language and how language is important and how framing it and how it's weaponized in order to stifle and perpetuate colonialism. And so like even with him saying like racist policy as opposed to systemic oppression, that's, it's complicated in that way, as in just stating what it is and really getting away from the idea of, the status quo and what we're really taught. So that's what I'm getting from.
Yeah, and I think you're spot on, right? And Kennedy is doing it more so through language, right? Like this, that's why the idea of being an anti-racist becomes so important, right? To focus on this idea of anti. But what Gilroy is doing is he's doing that work by flipping the margins. And this is how Gilroy is seeking to complicate how we're talking about and how we're thinking about these things. So let's think about modernity from the enslaved standpoint, right? They're gonna have a whole different perspective on the production of this new thing opposed to those who were doing the enslaving, right? Progress is gonna look a lot different for someone who has been placed in chains opposed to someone who's sipping sugar because of the labor of those who have been placed in chains, right? So this is what kind of Gilroy is trying to get us to think about. And this will be my last quote. I'm looking on page 55. I think this is him very clearly stating what he's seeking to do. This is towards the middle of the page, after the end note that says number 37, starting with the sentence that says the time. The time has come for the primal history of modernity to be reconstructed from the slave's point of view. These emerge in especially acute consciousness of both life and freedom, which is nurtured by the slave's mortal terror of his sovereign master, and the continuing trial by death, which slavery becomes for the male slave. This primal history offers a unique perspective on many of the key intellectual and political issues in the modern debate. So again, that's shifting their perspective to those who are being subjective, opposed to those who are doing the torture, doing the damage, and doing reaping the benefits of modernity is really the theme that I want you to walk away with as it pertains to this reading. What we'll do from here is we'll open it up for our fishbowl, and we'll have our discussion through the fishbowl, and we'll call it a day. Is there anyone who wants to volunteer the fishbowl?
I volunteer.
Stacey. Got you, Stacy. Thank you. Anyone else?
I volunteer.
Sandra, thank you.
Dang, now that we on Zoom, a lot of people volunteering.
Right.
I've only went once, so
Okay. You'll
I have
be good.
spoken class, but I guess I realized after every time I spoke in class that wasn't part of the fishbowl. So I
But
missed.
this will square you off for the semester, Cassandra. This will be your second, you'll be done. I think
Okay.
Stacey, you went last week also, correct? No.
I did talk last week, but it wasn't technically after you asked for the fishbowl, so I didn't know if it counted.
Okay.
Really dense, but I'm going to try.
Yeah, whatever you offer is cool, will work. Is there anyone else want to volunteer for the fishbowl? All right, we can go with two. Whoever wants to start it off, Stacey or Cassandra, it's on you.
Okay, I'll go.
Okay.
So I just wanted to bring attention to a story that was told in this chapter, the story of Margaret Garner. I had never heard about her before. I'd never read anything about it, but I read this little bit in this chapter about she escaped slavery in Kentucky, and she had her children with her, and she killed one of her babies in order to save her baby from becoming a slave, from being caught by the slave. And I thought it was just a story because I had seen the movie Beloved like a long time ago. And I know that horrific things happen. I know that like really, really bad and just tragic things happen, but I did not know that particular story was based on a true story. And I just can't even imagine, but I don't understand it in the fact that, I mean, I haven't experienced what she has, but just like the ones that chose to jump off the side of the ship or chose to kill themselves or do whatever they need to do to escape, she knew she did not want that for her babies. And that just really, really just spoke to me. I don't know, there's something about it. It's haunting. So I just wanted to bring attention to that story.
Yeah.
And I didn't know it was real. And also I had another question, and this is about the critical race theory, or the not necessarily critical race theory, but this is about the banning of books and the retelling of history. I'm not sure that it needs to be retold because it's already mostly from the perspective of the dominant culture. I don't understand why they feel that they need to retell it, or I mean, I do understand why they do, because they don't want anything in there that, sullies their image or makes their children feel bad. But does it make anyone, and anybody can answer, does it concern anybody? Does anyone feel like this is a little bit scary, that this is like, they're actually banning books, they're actually banning text, they're doing it, it's happening. I feel like it could slowly happen everywhere. Is anyone else concerned about it?
Fred?
I mean, I'm not really surprised, Stacy, considering like the political climate that we're in. So, but I think there's a quote where it says the more they try to restrict, the more pushback they're gonna get. So, I mean, they can bring it. It's just human beings in general are just curious. So those who are looking to seek out that information are gonna find it, and it's gonna find them too. You know what I'm saying? Like, we have the internet for a reason. So these kids are gonna grow up in that environment thinking like, okay, why did these old heads like ban these books? They're gonna find them online or move to a different place and discover those things. So yeah, it's unfortunate that they are banning it, but I honestly, I think that that information is just gonna spread like wildfire. So those books and that theory is just gonna blow up even more, and it's gonna be discussed even more.
And there's a lot of already like community organizations, grassroots organizations, and like communities that are, doing the level of higher thinking and decolonized teachings in their communities already. It's just about like making it more accessible and known. But there are like at my job on Friday, the other day, we were doing that. So it's like, I mean, yeah, it's not surprising. And yes, it's going to be inevitable, but the more they restrict, the more that there will be more community-led organizations and grassroots organizations that are telling the truth. And I think also, maybe, potentially, there could be a push for more people like me who are in higher education and studying this specifically to run white people out of this field of study. That's my intention. That's what I'm tired of sitting in lectures learning about my ancestors from people who don't look like me. So I feel like it might push more people to do that as well.
Well, I think Omi, you kind of get to my like the cat's out the bag, right? Like that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. Hopefully I'm inspiring more of you all to take the same path to where there'll be a whole bunch of us within these institutions and we kind of upend how these things work and what they look and feel like. But Stacey, to answer your question, I agree with both what Fred and Omi says. But also from my vantage point of engaging young minds on a weekly basis, right? There is already this prevailing notion of anti-literacy and anti-intellectualism that makes me very nervous, right? And you don't have to answer this, but think about it yourself. Outside of class, how much reading would you be doing? Would you be reading if you weren't a student, right? And I know based on conversations with you, Stacey, yes, you probably would. But for the average person, how often really are we picking up books, right? So what that is telling me that we're getting information from somewhere, but oftentimes they're not what we'll call source material, textbooks, right? This is a society where everyone has an opinion and everyone has a platform, right? And like I tell my kids, opinions are like assholes. Everyone got them, some of them stink, right? Like, and unfortunately, oftentimes we're being led by these shitty ass opinions and we're thinking that we're knowledgeable about things that we really don't know about. So it makes me weary to know that while this is already going on in our society, there's certain there's certain segments of our country where we're limiting even more access to information, right? And so things that are very normal stories like Emmett Till and things like that, they won't even be privy to that type of information, right? So it causes me to be a little bit concerned, and it causes the work that's going on in this course to be more of an imperative, right? And for me, it raises the stakes of the work that I seek to do, you know? Ultimately, it limits my occupational opportunities, right? Because there's certain states I just can't even go to work, right? Like I would not be able to have a job there because the things that I talk about will get me on that hotline, you know? So there are very, very real implications. There's a book that was turned into the movie, and I think it's called Fahrenheit 451 or something like that, where it talks about how books become illegal and they become banned and they become set on fire, right? Is this not the precedent for that type of society? If we're banning books and taking them off of the shelves, what's the next step would be to burn them, and that's not too far of a removed reality. You know what I mean? So to me, the colonization of information is a really important thing. And while I agree with both of you, Fred and Omi, what's going to happen is going to cause for us to engage in more fugitive type pedagogical practices, right? Where we'll have to return to the way that we used to do with sneaking and reading and things of that nature, stealing a moment to go learn something. It will open up those opportunities. But again, I ask, how many people are really willing to go read? And that's where it kind of gets sticky for me. Shabet?
Yes, I think because the mediums are shifting and just progress, and it's such a microwave society. A lot of times, I don't know. I have a love-hate with this whole meeting people where they're at thing. But when you have people who I hear all the time where I'm not reading all that. You know, they don't have the patience. It's very impulsive. And so I see figures like Chance, the rapper, and Vic Mensa, who I see have elements of Pan-Africanism where they're doing a lot of work in Ghana and trying to present that here and trying to get people here to go there. And they're trying to introduce that. And I think that can really evoke some thought like, okay, who is this Garvey person you're talking about? Who is that? I mean, I think when they see who they consider to be their leader, since it's such a group think, that they're going to have to get that from where they get it.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think to kind of tie what you said, Shabette, to what Fred was mentioning earlier in the sense of the role of the arts, right? Like that's a perfect example of how these arts movements produce new forms of thinking and expands intellectualism even. So yeah, that's a great point. Cassandra?
I did like the I guess when the author discussed Berman, he was looking at contemporary like art and from Black intellectuals, such as, for example, in the South Bronx, looking at dancers like the breakdancing movement and graffiti artists. And he acknowledges that Berman explains that people like the black people, and then he also mentions even like I think he says Latinos as well are not acknowledged in this. And, you know, these would be examples of including this in the modernity.
Yeah.
And I find that interesting. I do remember when I first went to college, it was totally different from high school. And yes, like you mentioned, Professor, like I had no interest to read in high school, mostly because it didn't relate to my life. Like I couldn't relate, and there was no way that like, you know, needing to worry about everything else going on at home or troubles or anything. Why would I want to read an American like history textbook and have to learn about people that I couldn't relate to? And so when I went to community college my first time, actually we had a book all about the counter storytelling, but all of the countries that America had invaded, but from the opposite point of view. It was Vietnam, like Cuba, like there was a whole list of people. So I remember finally finding myself in college for that, and then I majored in sociology, and then thinking like, why is this not taught? Why is sociology or just social aspects of relating students to their problems that they're experiencing not taught in these schools? And I remember how much different that would be, or you know, encouragement for students like myself at the time to go to college. And so I do agree that, you know, those topics should be mentioned in the classrooms, and it very does sadden me. There is a program called Girls Who Code, and it's basically for people of underrepresented people like Latinos, Black people, anybody. And it's mostly for young girls, but then also boys also included. But there's a book, and I think like there were some states that were trying to debate like not to include it because one of the little girls on the cover had short hair, as in the girl was a look as if they designed the little girl to look transgender or lesbian or something just because she had short hair. And I just thought like that's so appalling. Like only if I had something like that when I was younger. And yeah, so that's my point of view, or some topics I wanted to bring enlightenment to. And I feel like that's an example of like what Berman is trying to mention would be part of the modernity for the Enlightenment project, in my point of view.
Yeah, so that's Gilroy using the work of Berman to kind of prove his point. Can I ask you all a question? Because with Cassandra, what I'm attentive to in her statement was this idea of relevance, right? And it's like, yeah, I don't want to read because it's not really saying anything that speaks to me. And it doesn't, for those of you who took in other Black Studies courses, you don't have to just think about this one, but for those of you who have not taken any other Black Studies course, do you find there being a relevance to the material that we engage? Or for that matter, when there's discussion had about the material, do you find that it relates to your quotidian or everyday lives? Honestly, and you don't have to say this just for my ego, right? But like, if you feel it doesn't, then it doesn't. But if you feel that it does, let's talk about it.
If no one has anything to say, I actually did experience that in college in the Bay Area. So the school I went to, almost all my classes were putting in relation to, like, they discussed the differences between our high schools compared to, say, the air pollution from East Palo Alto and Palo Alto, why the semi trucks are allowed to be on the freeway in East Palo Alto and not Palo Alto, and then like just diving into things like that. And then also, like I mentioned, the books that I read that were assigned to us to read for a history class was on a counterpart, and it was an art history. So it was like part of the humanities requirement, but that was a chosen topic. So the professor that they chose, it probably was based on the professors that they chose at that school.
Gotcha. Okay. And the reason why I asked this, right? And one of the things I'm kind of remiss about this course, yes, the subject matter is a Black diaspora, but I would like to center more of the work of the discipline of Africana studies, of Black studies within our conversations, right? And one of the goals of Black Africana studies is to provide a relevant and pertinent education, right? So what you're learning should be applicable to what you're going through. It's this idea of praxis, right? Like, so what you're theoretically meditating on should be able to be applied to your everyday life, lived experiences. And this is one of the goals of Africana studies, right? So when I hear Cassandra talk about how she wants, what interests her as a reader is things that are relevant, to me, that is the work of the discipline, right? All of the things that, all of the material that you should engage in a Black studies course should at some foundational or fundamental level be relevant to how you are positioned in this world, right? And as a practitioner of the discourse, right? I got to make sure that I'm giving you relevant information. If not, I'm not doing my job, right? So if you feel that you're engaging material that has nothing to do with your lived experience as an African person, then there's something that I'm dropping the ball on in the material that you're being presented and how I'm talking about or presenting that material to you, right? So that's why, for me, that's a really important question about the relevancy of what you're learning and how that applies to your everyday lives. Let's get two more comments, questions, or concerns, and we'll call it a day.
To go back to your question about, do I feel like this information is relevant for me? Well, I am Black, so yes, it relates to me, but also like the stuff is dense, it's hard, it's difficult, it's not easy but it does offer information that I didn't know before. It does, like the conversations that we have when we go through the readings, like I am learning things, and I do feel like these are things that can be applied to my life going forward. So I feel like it's relevant.
Cool. I appreciate that. Fred, go ahead.
I mean, you already know, like, it is like very, very relevant to me, not only to me, but like to my community, especially, which is why like I really made it a mission to like bring you in that space, because like people need to know. And just seeing, I guess I can talk about him, just seeing like Damien kind of discover like what Blackness is for him, and how some certain themes are clicking for him and moving forward. Like he'll just be thinking about that for like the rest of his life. So yeah, it's super relevant. And then going back to the reading thing, I think a lot of people just don't know how to read. And a lot of people don't know that reading is honestly like a form of meditation, because you have to sit there and concentrate and digest like what you're taking in. Some people just open up the book, they just read, and they don't like take notes or really like highlight what they're doing. So like, I guess teaching like our kids or just like the younger generation how to like be engaged with the material will definitely, I guess, bring back that urgency in terms of like books. Yeah. Because it's fun. Like once you actually know how to read, it's super fun. It is time consuming, yeah, but yeah, that's pretty much what I have to say. I think Damien, you had your
and real quick before you jump to Damien, I just want to, the idea of how to read, like that is foundationally important, because even for me, like I knew how to read, but going into a PhD program, right, it's a different level of reading. And that's why for me, as much as I can, I try to like highlight to you all like the little tools of how to read. For example, if you see an author say in other words, you know he's going to restate what he just said. So little elements like that allowed me to be a more efficient reader when it comes to these very dense texts. And that's why a part of my project with you all is to put you on these little things so you know and understand how to read at this very high upper graduate level. This is why things like, what's the thesis? What's your analysis? How is it applying to what's going on in the world today? And questions become important, because when you're reading at these high levels, those are 4 things that you should be able to extract from a reading if you engage it at any level. Like basic, you should know the analysis, you should know the thesis, and you should have some form of questions that have been produced. Damien?
Sorry, I know you only said like 2 more people, but really quick, I just wanted to say I'm not Black, obviously, but I think this class, and then it's interesting that you mentioned, you know, classes that we have taken in the past about African or Black studies. This is one of those classes that, you know, and I wasn't a big reader either. Honestly, I'm genuinely not a big reader. I think I'm a good reader, but that's just because I take the time for it. But I think classes like this, and this class very specifically, I find myself, my brain, my brain opening up a lot more in a way that isn't, you know, it can't be found in other conventional classes. Like I have other, you know, classes that talk about history, and yeah, we're talking a lot about history, but it's more history that changes your framework on what life looks like now and why it is what it is. So much so that, like, for me, I know that you're teaching a class in the winter quarter, I believe you mentioned, right? And that's something that I have been wanting to reach out to you and ask about, what, because I looked for it, I couldn't find that class. It's something that like I would continuously like to pursue, even it has nothing to do with my degree, because it's so awakening, and the reading is challenging, but it's rewarding at the end. So if it is at all possible, and you are still, because I know that you did mention that you're going to discuss that book that and mentioned, if it's possible to, I don't know if there's a code or if there's, I couldn't find your class, honestly.
Yeah, so real quick, just because I know we're running low on time, I've reached out to the chair to see if she would be willing to offer it for the winter. How it shows on my contract is I'll actually be teaching in the spring quarter, in this intro into Black studies, but I'm asking if she could offer it for the winter quarter and the spring quarter. And I just haven't heard back from her yet. So as soon as I get some information, I'll let you all know. In fact, just to keep it a beam with y'all, like, actually, hold on.